We're going to build a game here. Very simple game, Pong. Actually, it's going to be a little more complicated than you actually think it is. We're going to start with some really simple stuff. We're going to start down here in the bottom right corner, and we're actually going to get rid of this cat sprite. He's not going to be really overly useful to us. So I'm going to get rid of the cat sprite, and then right down here where we see the cat figure, there's a choose a sprite, and that brings us to a sprite library. And in that sprite library, we have all sorts of things as preloaded sprites. The one that we're going to use is this ball, because I know the ball will work with all of the coding that we have. When we bring the ball in place, it has a good name. It's a ball, obviously. It randomly places it on the XY. We're going to just put it at 0, 0 to begin with. So I can put a 0 there and a 0 there. And now the first thing we're going to do is move this ball to a good start position. As well as moving the ball to a good start position, we will take this ball and we'll start moving it around our screen. We'll get it to a point where we've got a ball bouncing around. And also today we'll get it to not only to have the ball bouncing around, but we'll also have it where we'll build a paddle where the ball will also interface the paddle. I think that's as far as we'll take it today. Feel free to stop the video at any time. Just pause it so you can get the code that you need loaded into your program and continually test it and make sure that you've got something built that is working the way that I've got mine built. So to start, we're going to get this ball to move. So we've got this ball in place. You can see it's 100% size. It's fine. And it's pointed in a direction of 90, which means if we move it, it's going to move towards the right side of the screen. We know that's going to happen at the beginning. So let's get that started right first. So we'll go to events. We'll bring in the when clicked event, which is our starting event. So anytime we click this flag, our game will get started. And then we're going to come to motion. We're going to grab this move 10 steps. So every time that we click this, that ball moves 10 steps towards the right. So that's 10 pixels towards the edge of this screen. Now that's all fine and dandy. We got the ball starting from the middle. That's not necessarily the greatest place for this ball to start. In this game, we're going to play the game vertically, so we're going to have a paddle move across the bottom of the screen, and then we'll have the ball come down the screen. So we actually want the ball to start near the top of the screen. So we're going to do that by giving the ball a position near the top of the screen. And we're going to grab this go to XY. I'm going to place that right up in here. We're going to put it above the move 10 steps. And so this is going to move the ball to the top of the screen every time that we hit this start. And we're not actually going to see it move 10 steps much anymore, but we'll be making some code changes in here to make things a little better. So I'm going to start the ball at the center of the screen as far as the x-axis goes. And we're going to put it near the top of the screen. Now we know the top of the screen is 180 pixels. At the very top, our position 180. The bottom of the screen is negative 180. So we'll get it close to the top of the screen. So we'll put it at about 175. So when we do that and we click start, that ball will jump to the top of the screen. Now the ball's not really going to move yet because every time we click this, it's going to continually reset itself to this position. So in order to get our ball to move, we also want our ball to move continuously so we don't have to continually click this flag. And in order to get the ball to move continuously, we're going to need a looping structure. And what that looping structure will do is will repeat code for us. And our looping structures are found under control. And the one looping structure we're going to bring in here is the forever loop. And that forever loop, when we attach it to our code, will run whatever code is inside this forever loop forever. Pretty straightforward stuff. So we're going to grab this move 10 steps and we're going to throw it in here. And we're going to just nicely plug this in up top. So when we start the game, our ball will automatically run to 0, 175. And then forever, it will move 10 steps. And when it gets to the bottom of the forever, it only goes back to the top of the forever. So it will not play this again. This is only going to ever happen once. And so when I click the screen, you'll notice the ball is going to move, still at 90 degrees, still towards the right edge of the screen. It'll move forever. If I hit stop, it doesn't look like much happens, but the code is no longer running. If I hit the green flag again, the ball should jump back here and move right across the screen, just like that. So that's working for us. But now we have an issue that the ball moves to the right of the screen, and that's not useful to us. We want the ball to move in a north-south, up and down fashion. So we need to get the ball to point towards the bottom of the screen. We can do that in two places. We can do that down here where it says direction, which I don't like doing it down here. I always like to keep my directions default 90 in the Sprite box. It just works whenever I'm doing something a lot more complicated. I always know that I'm referring to 90 degrees and I'm making changes. But we can do that really simple with our code. In order to do that simple with our code, I'm just going to go to Motion. And in Motion, we're going to grab this thing called point in direction. And we're going to bring a point in direction and we're going to put it in here above the forever loop. It does not matter if it goes above the go to XY or below the go to XY, as long as we're outside of the forever loop. And we're going to point this to move down the screen. I can grab my arrow here and say that's pointing towards 180 degrees, or I can just type in 180 degrees. And that means the ball is now oriented to move downwards. So here you'll notice by default it still says 90 down over here, but now when I press the game, it's going to change that, and the ball moves towards the bottom of the screen. Every time I hit that button, the ball moves towards the bottom of the screen. Now might be a good time for you to pause in order to ensure that you've got this code in place and your ball moves towards the bottom of the screen. I'll resume the video in just a few seconds. Hopefully you now have your code in place where your ball moves towards the bottom of the screen every time you hit the flag. Now the ball moves straight down. That's fine and okay, but when this game starts, every time the ball gets played, it will always come towards the bottom of the screen. And we would like to have the player actually be guessing at which way the ball goes, and so that the ball bounces in different directions. In order to do that, we need to get the ball to randomly move towards the bottom of the screen over a particular range. We don't want it to move straight down. So I'm just going to pull up down here, again, that direction circle that we have. Now, currently the ball moves straight down. When the game starts, we do not want the ball to move up. We do not want the ball to move directly left or right. We want it to move in some sort of downward direction. So a good range to have it move is if you have a look at this, moving the ball out in that direction, which is about 135 degrees, is going to be useful to us. It'll have the ball start at the top and move downward in an angle like that. Also, if we move over here to about 225 degrees, the ball will move out in a direction like that. And we can actually program this ball to choose a random angle, this direction or that direction. So that's going to be rather useful to us. So in order to do that, we're going to use this point in direction, but we're going to bring in a math block, which is going to generate a random number for us over a range. So our math blocks are under the green. They're called operators. You'll see these are all our mathematical functions, plus and minus and multiplies and divides, but we're going to grab this pick random function. We're going to bring it over here. And what I want you to see before I put it in place is that this pick random has got rounded edges on it. And this point in direction has got rounded edges. And this here will plug right into there. You notice it highlights a nice white. We drop it in. Now, the range that we want to put this in is we want it to pick a random number between 135 and about 225. We do not want to reverse the numbers. If we pick the numbers between 125 and 225, it will pick a number between here and over here. That means the ball will continually move in a downward direction. If we change those numbers and say we have 225 first and 135 first, it'll pick a random number from here around the top of the circle over to the other side, which means when you start the game, the ball most of the time will move in an upward direction, and that's not quite what we want. So the fact that we've got this in here, if we now press play, you'll notice that the ball moves downward. Every time we start this game, the ball moves downward in a random direction. You're never quite sure what angle it's going to be at. So that is going to make the game play so the player has a little more guessing as to what direction the ball is going to go. Last thing we're going to do in this little video before I stop it, and then we'll do the next little bit, is I am going to make it so this ball bounces around our screen. Because in most instances in a game like this, anytime a ball comes and hits a paddle or hits anything else, it bounces. For now, we'll have it bounce on the bottom. We're going to change that later for the gameplay, but we also want it to bounce on the sides and on the top. So in order to get it to do that, we're going to use something inside the forever loop. And Scratch has a nice little piece of programming built in. It's a function that's built in, so you don't have to do any extra coding to do so. If I pull down a little bit, we'll get this code called if on edge bounce. So we're going to put if on edge bounce right here. And what's going to happen is the ball is going to go to the top of the screen. It's going to pick a random direction to move in. And then forever, it's going to move 10 steps. After it moves 10 steps, it's going to check if it is touching the edge of the screen anywhere. If it is touching the edge of the screen, it's going to bounce. If it is not touching the edge of the screen, it's going to ignore this bounce code, and it's just going to go back to the top and move another 10 steps. So when we start, the ball will do a whole bunch of moving 10 steps until it hits the edge of the screen. So here we go. Here's our ball bouncing every time it hits the edge of the screen. It doesn't matter what side of the screen it hits, it's going to bounce. So here's another good place to pause the video. You make sure you get in your proper code, and I will continue the video again in just a few seconds. Now that we've got a ball in there which is bouncing, that's fantastic. We're now going to build a paddle sprite. And this sprite is what we're going to use in order to interact with the ball so that the user is going to be able to control it so that the ball touches the paddle and the paddle will bounce and go the other direction. In order to build this, we're going to build a sprite. The paddle is going to be really simple. It's just going to be a rectangle, and I'll explain how we build the sprites here. So down in our sprite chooser, you're going to see there's a paintbrush, which in that paintbrush is going to bring up the sprite editor. When we bring up the sprite editor, the tab over here changes to costumes. This is called Costume 1. We don't really have a name for our sprite yet. The new sprite down here says Sprite 1 and Sprite 1. That is a terrible name. We're going to call it Paddle. And when I hit enter there, it will change the name to Paddle. That's going to be useful. Costume 1 is fine. We're not going to make any costume for this. Costume is just so we can change appearance of our object as we need to. We don't need to for this. What I would like you to do is I would like you to find a color that you like. It doesn't matter what color you make it. I'm just going to use mine as the default purple. It's just a fine color. I don't need to change that. But now when we make this sprite, what I want you to notice is it's brought up a stage for us. And it's brought up a stage with a checkerboard, meaning that checkerboard means that everything here is transparent. It's see-through. But you'll also notice on this checkerboard is this crosshair. And this crosshair is equal to the 0, 0 on the stage. It's equal to the center of the stage. And your life can be made easier if you build your sprites and try to get the center of your sprite as close as possible to this 0, 0. The reason we want to do that is for when we make our measurements and we're moving things on the XY, positive X and positive Y towards the top, the bottom, left, or right of the screen, it will measure the same way as all the default sprites do, because all the default sprites like to measure themselves off against 0, 0. They're all built on the screen around 0, 0. So I'm going to show you quickly how to make a paddle. Making a paddle is easy. Once you got your color chosen, I'm just going to come over here to the rectangle, and then I'm going to start my rectangle a little off to the top left here. I'm just going to drag and pull. And the center of this is pretty much close to that 0, 0. I can take it, I can move it, and again, try to drop it right over top of that 0, 0. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it's got to be close. And if you have a look at the size of my paddle here, and you have a look at the size of my paddle there, and it doesn't matter where it shows up on the screen, it's more just the size of the paddle, that's a good size for your paddle. Anything bigger will make the game too easy to play. Anything smaller will make the game a little bit too tough to play. Once we've got that built, we're going to be ready to code it. If you happen to not get it built right or you're not happy with it, you can fully erase it using the eraser. Inside the desktop program, if you hit the buttons Control Z, it may go away for you. Or what you can do is grab the selection tool, highlight it, and then just hit your delete button and it goes away. And then you can just grab the rectangle and again build yourself another paddle, and that paddle will nicely be in place. I'm going to pause the video here for a few seconds, and then you can get yourself a paddle built, and we'll continue on shortly. All right, now that you got a paddle built and your paddle is sitting there, we're going to come back and we're going to hit the code tab. And what we're going to do with this paddle is we're going to position the paddle just like we positioned the ball. So we're going to go to events and we're going to make sure that we've got the paddle showing here so that we're programming on the paddle. You'll notice the paddle is shown here and the paddle also highlights blue down here when we're programming that particular paddle. For some reason my name didn't take. I know why my name didn't take. It's because I erased it at one point. So I'm going to rename it paddle, which is what we need to do because we're going to need to refer to that name later. Please don't ever leave it called Sprite 1. And I'm going to come over here and I'm going to bring in my when clicked. Then I'm going to grab motion. We're going to grab a go to XY. And for this particular paddle, we want it to locate near the bottom of the screen, but we don't want it to touch the bottom of the screen. We're going to have it off the bottom of the screen. And we're going to start it in the center of the screen. So again, we're going to start in the center of the screen. So we're going to make it 0 on the X. But now instead of going to 175 on the top, I'm going to go to about minus 150 here. And everybody's is going to be a little different because their paddles are probably going to be a little different. When I click it, that's a good place to be. You want a gap at the bottom of the screen. Your numbers might be a little bit different in order to get that gap. So right now, my paddle is positioned. There's a number of different ways we can control the paddle. We can control the paddle through our mouse. We can just have it follow mouse positions if we want, or we can control it through the keys. And for this game, we're going to control this paddle through the keys. In order to control the paddle through the keys, we're going to have to do a couple of things. We're going to have to do a forever statement, just like we did with the ball. And we're going to have to bring in some decision structures. We're going to have to bring in some if statements, which are going to ask the computer a question. And I'm going to show you how that looks right now. So we're going to go to control, and we're going to bring in a forever statement, and we're going to drop the forever right in here. And then also under the control, we're going to bring in just a plain if. An if then right here. And that if then is going to get dropped inside the forever. Now in this if then, if what? Well, we have to set up a question, or what we call a statement that the computer is going to have to test on whether or not that statement is true or false. Because if statements only work when statements are true. Now, in order to do this, we're going to go to sensing because we're going to be putting some data input into the computer. And we're going to bring, you'll notice that this has got sort of a diamond shape and this has kind of a diamond shape. And we're going to bring this in over here and we're going to bring if key space pressed. Now, we're not actually going to use the key space. On my keyboard, I'm going to use my left and right arrow keys. And to start, I'm going to get this paddle moving to the right. So I'm going to select my right arrow. So if the key right arrow is pressed, if it is pressed and I press it on my keyboard, it will return a true function and it will do what's inside this if statement. If it's not pressed, it will ignore this whole code. So what do I want it to do if it's pressed? Well, we're going to bring in a quick motion and we're going to do a move 10 steps. Now, what direction is that 10 steps going to move it? Well, it's oriented to the right. So 10 steps is going to move it to the right side of the screen. If I press play and I hold down my button, it moves to the right. Now, I can't get it to move to the left. Why can I not get it to move to the left? Well, because I haven't programmed it to move to the left. I programmed it to move to the right. So if 10 steps gets it to move to the right, what's going to get it to move to the left? Well, minus 10 steps will get it to move to the left. So a couple of things I need to do here. I can go over here and I can drag in a new if statement and plug it right in here, right below there. Or I can make my life easier by right-clicking on this if statement and duplicating the code. And if I duplicate the code, it gives me the code I already have. I can plug it right in below. To go left, I'm going to grab left arrow. And I'm going to grab my move at minus 10 steps. So once I've got that done now, if I play the game, if I move this keyboard to the right, press my right arrow key, it moves to the right. If I use my left arrow key, it moves to the left. Now, 10 steps is actually going to be a little slow. Over the years of building a game like this, we've kind of got it mastered that 15 steps and negative 15 steps are kind of optimal. 20 gets a little fast. As you'll notice, it moves a little faster. So I'm going to pause the video here right now, or you should pause the video here right now and get this code in place. So you've got a paddle built and a paddle that moves to the left and right 15 and negative 15 steps. Now what you'll have noticed that you've got your paddle moving to the left or right. Your ball kind of ignores your paddle. Your ball just kind of moves through the paddle as if the paddle's not even there. Well, we're just about to fix that, because the reason it ignores it is because we haven't actually told them to interact yet. So what we're going to have to do is code some collision detection so that the ball knows that the paddle's there. In order to do that, we're actually going to code that on the ball. So if we come down here and we click the ball becomes blue, and the blue comes here, and the ball's coding comes back. We are going to add a piece of coding in here, very much like our if press our right key, if press our left key, we get the paddle to move. We're going to use another if statement, and we're going to use if statements all the time. Those are the things that are going to allow the computer to make the decisions there, the program to make the decisions that it makes. So we're going to bring in an if statement here that's going to basically have the ball check to see whether it's touching the paddle. All right, so in order to do that, we're going to bring in another if statement, and that if statement we're going to drop right below this if on edge bounce. It's got to be inside the forever loop because we need the program to continually check, am I on edge? Am I touching the paddle? Am I on edge? Am I touching the paddle? So we're going to go back to sensing, and we're going to bring in touching. And we're going to pull down, and you're going to see that your paddle is sitting there. And the paddle is nicely sitting there because we named it. If we left it at Sprite 1, it would say Sprite 1. That's why naming things this way is nice, because you can really tell what your objects are. So this is going to be a decision if touching paddle. Well, if it's touching the paddle, what do we want it to do? Well, what we want this ball to do if it's touching the paddle, we want it to bounce off. But what direction do we want it to bounce? We don't want it to bounce down this direction. That would be silly. We want it to change directions, and we want it to move upward. Much like we did this to get the ball to move downwards between 135 degrees and 225 degrees, we want the ball to move upward between, say, about 320 degrees and about 45, or 310 degrees, or 315 degrees and about 45 degrees. So we want it to bounce off that way to that way. Now, in order to get it to do so, though, we have to make a couple of changes, because for some reason, Scratch doesn't like putting in positive numbers to go this direction up top. It likes negative numbers. So we're actually going to have the ball bounce between negative 45 degrees to go this way and 45 degrees to go that way. So if touching the paddle, we're going to bring a point in direction. Then we're going to go bring a math operator, pick random, and in that pick random, we're going to go negative 45 to 45. Now, when we restart this game, if you get your paddle in the way, the ball should now sense it, and the ball should move the opposite direction. Okay, so what you've got now is a basic prototype game where the ball just kind of bounces. We're only going to do one more thing today, and that one more thing today is what happens if we miss the ball. If we miss the ball currently, that ball bounces off the bottom of the screen. So I want you to pause right now, make sure you get the proper code in place so that the ball bounces off the paddle. And then we'll code one last thing today is we'll have the ball stop when it hits the bottom of the page instead of continuing on. So we'll start that again in just a few seconds. All right, now continuing on. In order to get the ball to stop when it hits the bottom of the page, we actually have to prevent the ball from hitting the bottom edge. because we already know if the ball is on edge, it will bounce. So we have to stop it from hitting the bottom edge. And that's part of the reason why we have a gap up here. What we're going to do is we're going to make another sprite, which is going to go along the bottom edge, which is going to be called, well, we're going to call it bottom edge. And it's going to be just a different colored rectangle that runs completely across the screen. We'll position it, and you'll see what happens with that here. So we're going to come down here to our sprites again. We're going to paint a new sprite. I'm going to select a different color here. Let's see. Let's make this one red, just for the sake of making it red. And I think it's outline. I will also make its outline red, just so it's all sort of one color. And then I'll just nicely do this, and I will drag it. It doesn't have to be very thick, this one, and I need it from the very edge. Come on, make it to the very edge. I need it to go from edge to edge. Edge to edge is going to be important, and it doesn't have to be very thick, and it's not positioned quite right. And once we've got that built, which doesn't take very long, we're going to do what we've done with the other stuff. We are nicely going to take this and we are going to position it. I'm going to go to XY, and I'm going to position it again in the center, and I'm going to put it down at minus 180. See if I can get it to go to the bottom of the screen. Now, it doesn't quite have the gap that I want because I'm going to need a gap between these two. So I can see if I can push it a little further. Will it go to 185? It will, but I don't quite have the gap that I want. So if I don't have the gap that I want, I'm actually going to end up moving this up a little higher, or I can take my sprite and make my sprite a little thinner. I might just go and, can I edit my sprite? Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I'm going to come back to my costumes. Here's my sprite. And the thing I think I'm going to do is actually not make the change that way. I think what I'm going to do with this sprite is actually come back to the code. I think I'm just going to change the position of my paddle. But before I do that, I better take this new sprite that I made and give it a name. I'm going to call it bottom underscore edge. So it's got one big long name. Hit enter, bottom edge. And then all I'm going to do in order to make this work is I'm going to come to my paddle. And instead of my paddle being at negative 150, I'm going to make my paddle negative 145. Now, all of our numbers might be slightly different. I just want a gap between my paddle and my bottom edge so that the game looks like this. If your game looks like this with your paddle, with your bottom edge built without having to move the paddle, you're in great shape. Just make it so it's got that gap. So you should pause right here, make sure you got your new sprite built, make sure there's a gap in between the two, and we'll carry on from here in just a minute. All right, carrying on. Simple bit of code to go. It's going to go inside the ball. We're now going to have the ball interact with the bottom of the screen. And when we have the ball interact with the bottom of the screen, we're just going to have the ball stop right now. We'll add all sorts of other effects and things to that ball tomorrow. So really quite simple. We are going to go to our ball code. And in our ball code, we know that we have an if touching paddle that it's supposed to change direction. We're going to bring in a very similar piece of code to what happens if it's touching the bottom edge. So right over here, we're going to come to controls. We're going to go bring in an if, and then I'm going to go to sensing, and I'm going to bring in touching, and we're going to pull down the list to bottom edge. And if touching bottom edge, we can do a couple of things. We can throw in a stop all, which will stop the entire game, or we can just do a stop movement. So we'll bring in something really simple. We'll bring in a control, and let's see how a stop all works for us. Now, stop all will stop all the code on all of the sprites across the entire game. And so now if I do this and I hit the ball, it bounces. If I come over here and hit the ball, oh, it stops. It no longer bounces. And that's now, and we can no longer move. That sort of prevented the ball from bouncing and having this continuous game. So this is a simple, basic working game. Starting tomorrow, we're going to add all sorts of things to change gameplay. We're going to add different effects for when the ball hits the bottom. We'll add different effects for when the ball hits the paddle. We'll do scoring. We'll do high scores. We'll do backgrounds. We will do changing backgrounds. We'll have the ball change colors. We'll have game over screens. There's all sorts of different things that we're going to add to this. We'll make the game harder to play. We'll add speed. So every time you touch the paddle, the game will speed up. So we've got a lot to do. We'll get through most of it tomorrow, and we'll probably finish the rest of it the next day. So hopefully this was good and got you started. And we'll talk to you soon.